Hello and welcome back to Kilted Swine BBQ. I'm your host and pitmaster Bob Sellers Jr. And today we are going to try Tater Tot Hotdish on the Akorn Kamado. If you'd like more information about my various smoking adventures or misadventures or competitions, you can check out my team website at kiltedswinebbq.com or my Weird Wild West books at sellersjr.com. I also have a shop with several different variations of logos for my smoking team at shop.kiltedswinebbq.com as well. So today what we're going to do is we're going to first smoke up some tater tots, then we're going to put together the hot dish, and we're going to try also demonstrating the use of a smoke box. Smoke box involves using wood chips that have been soaked and set next to the heat source. Some people use water, that's what I'll be using today. Some use apple juice. Others will use a multitude of different liquids. The thing you want to avoid is anything that's flammable because you don't want the wood to catch fire. You want it to smolder and give off the smoke that you're looking for. So with that, we will get started here. For today's smoke box demonstration, we are going to be using McLean's Bourbon Barrel smoking chips that are authentic and burn longer, supposedly. I have no affiliation with this product other than having seen it on the store shelf and was intrigued, so I got some for it. This demonstration. Now, what you want to do is measure out how much chips you're going to need for your smoke box. Now the way you do that is you generally just pour in, I usually do a smoke box full, and the reason you don't want to have too terribly much extra, you pour it into a bowl. Now I may use 2 smoke boxes, so I'm going to do probably 2.5 boxes of wood chips, because we're going to be smoking both the tater tots and eventually we'll be putting the hot dish back on. So we'll put that like so. Put your wood chips off to the side, picking up any extras that you may have spilled along the way. Next you want to do is put in some water. Now, a couple different ways you can do this. I like to use my favorite device here, and I use this when I take the wood out to drain it, because you don't want the wood to be wet in the smoke box. You want it to be damp. You don't want it to be dripping wet. So what I'll do is I'll pour this through this at the time. And what this does is it helps hold it, the wood, in the water, so it doesn't necessarily all float on the top. And then you put that aside and let it soak for anywhere from a half hour to an hour, depending upon what you like to do. I usually go about an hour, half hour, somewhere in there. Some people go overnight. We're just going to let this soak here, and then we're going to go inside and start preparing some of the other parts of this that we will be doing. For today's cook with the hot dish, we are going to be using a little bit of marinade of Mr. and Mrs. T's spicy and bold Bloody Mary sauce, a little bit of Tennessee Old Smoky salty caramel whiskey, and of course a little bit of Johnny's French dip au jus. So we're going to start with is the meat, which is a pound of ground beef. In this case I went with 85% lean. And we're going to go with a pound of Italian sausage ground up. So what we want to do Put that in a pan, break it up a little bit beforehand. At least as best you can, because we're going to be frying this up and browning it, and it'll break up a little bit better then. But what we're looking now to do is mix this in with the hamburger and then put a little bit of liquid on it and let it sit. So next we will take this and go along and get the hamburger out. So we're going to break this up. We're going to mix them together. Again, it's just important to expose as much of the meat here to the marinade. And we are going to take off these gloves. And we're going to start out with the Bloody Mary mix. You can mix up as much as you want. I tend to try to keep it within certain measurements. So what you do is you pour this over liberally as you can. We'll mix this up better by hand here in a minute. You want to take 1/3 of a cup of the whiskey, again, this just adds a little nuance to the meat. Smell it. It smells delish. So then we're going to take a little bit of the au jus and we're going to do the same thing. So there we have the marinade done. And now I'm going to take this, mix it up by hand, and just let it sit for about an hour. And while we're doing that, we will get the fire going and get the potatoes on. So the idea here is you want to get as much of the hamburger and sausage in the liquid. There's a lot of different ways you can do it. Don't take mine as the best, but a lot of this over the hour might get absorbed into the hamburger and sausage. We'll see. You don't want to go too terribly long because then it'll just get mushy. Which, since we're going to be browning it anyway, it probably isn't as big a deal as I make it out to be, but something to think about when you're planning this. So, as you can see, a lot of the liquid is already kind of absorbed into the hamburger and sausage. And we are going to let that, I'm going to pat it down so that it's tight to the bottom, and the liquid will hopefully find a way to get to the top. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover this and let it sit for an hour, and I am going to go get the tater tots ready, and I'm going to get the fire going, and we will be back. So as you can see, for today's cook, I've mixed a little bit of B&B, both lump and briquette, in the base of the Akorn Kamado. I left an opening because, as usual, I'm going to light a small chimney outside of the cooker and get the briquettes down to a gray ash setting of sorts, if you want to call it that. And then I'm going to pour them in so that we'll have the fire going almost immediately. I prefer to do it that way. Other people do start it in the cooker itself, but now you can see we are going to use a little bit of the tumbleweed fire starters. I usually use the wax one, but I like starting my fire outside of the cooker just because it gives me a little better idea of what my ash looks like. So we're going to let that go, and we will be back. We'll put it into the cooker. Now, as another note, when you do it the way I'm doing it, you want to make sure that the bottom vent is completely closed, because when you're pouring hot coals into any cooker, there is a chance that the ash could come out the vent and out at your feet if you do not have proper protection on, and or have a flammable surface that you are cooking on. So we'll be back in a bit. All right, first and foremost, just to let you know, I do try out the products I use before I use them, and I found this Old Smoky whiskey is very good for sipping. So now we're going to move to the tater tot part of this, and not knowing how they're going to spread out, I'm going to use 2 pans. Now these are simple grilling pans that I've picked up, I believe, at Menards, but I'm sure you could find them elsewhere. And what they basically are 2 halves, so you can do a half or a whole one. I have 2 whole pans out in my arsenal. Basically, we're just going to spread everything out onto these. We're going to cook all of them up. Primarily with this Tater Tot Hot Dish, the tater tots will be on the bottom. Some might be on the top if we have some extra that we don't have the pan completely full. But the idea here is to get the tater tots as a base and everything else above. These are chopped seasoned potatoes, potato puffs from Hy-Vee. I'm sure you could use whatever tater tots you would like to use. I'm not going to season them any more than they already are, but I'm going to get them to set out here, and while they're all set to go on the fire, we are going to go see how the coals are doing and get this first part of the cook going. So in a separate bowl, what you can do is start to mix up the stuffing, as it were. So in this case, I'm using Veg-All 7-in-1 mixed vegetables, can of that, drained. And I'm also using some Hy-Vee diced tomatoes and green chilies with lime and cilantro, also drained. So along with that, I'm going to try some Fiesta mild fresh salsa, about a can's worth. Drain as much liquid out as you can when you're taking this out. The idea is to get mixed equal proportions for your different elements without spilling too badly. And what this will add is some onions, more tomatoes, obviously, some green peppers, and a little bit of spice to it, not a whole lot, hopefully. But as you can see, I'm measuring it out into the diced tomato can. And then we're just going to mix this up. And it's all right if there's a little bit of liquid, we'll drain it out after it sits for a little while and pun not intended, vegetates. And this will be part of the hot dish center to go along with the meat and to give it a little bit of taco twist to it. We'll also be adding some taco seasoning once we get going. But the idea behind a hot dish like this is you get all your vegetables as well as your meat in one dish. Now some of you might be saying, why does he keep saying hot dish and not casserole? Well, where I grew up, hot dishes were hot dishes. Casseroles were cold dishes. Tuna salad, chicken salad, potato salad, things like that. In reality, from what I've learned in my research, that all hot dishes can be, but doesn't mean they should be considered casseroles. But not all casseroles can be considered hot dishes. Obviously, when you have the cold variations that I mentioned earlier, those are not hot. So I will continue to call it hot dish because that's what I grew up with it being called. And for the sake of this video, I will continue to call it that. So if you want to make it and call it your casserole, be my guest. More power to you. Now we're going to let this sit for a little while. And again, pun not intended, we're going to let it vegetate. Get the seasoning spread out over all the vegetables inside there. And we're going to go check the fire because it should be about ready to pour in and get the potatoes cooking outside. Now before the fire gets going too terribly hot, load it in, we're going to take the aforementioned wood chips and drain them out of the water. Again, you don't want to have a whole lot of water when you're pouring it into the smoke box. Invariably you'll get some, but you can always drain it if you feel the need. So we're going to do just enough to fill it up. And have this all set, because once we put the coals in, we don't want the fire to get going too fast. So now that the ash on the fire coals have ashed over quite nicely, remember I closed the vent to prevent any overflow. And I'm going to mix or push in the coals. So we get a nice mix here. While that's doing that, I'm going to put in a ceramic plate. And now, this is your final chance to drain out the wood chunks, which, for the sake of this example, I'm going to try them away from the direct fire, but over where I'll put them over here and see how the smoke ends up coming out of it. Next, we want to put the grate in, and along with that, I'm going to put in my AGY. And again, if you don't have a wireless thermometer, I recommend getting one, even one of the cheaper ones, because you'll find you want to know what the grate level temperature is. Now, as you notice, I've also taken out the center grate when I was moving the big grate around. I watched a video, or a gentleman said he had his break. So now I'm going to open the bottom vent up. I'm going to watch and keep an eye on the AJY and see when we break 200 degrees. Because once we break 200 degrees, then I'm going to want to start to cut down things. And we'll be back. All right, you can see by the AJY we've reached 232 degrees. So now I've turned down the top vent to about a crack. I'm going to turn it down a little bit more because I don't want it to go too terribly far over 250. And the bottom one I've closed down to a pinky, as I heard one YouTube cook refer to it. Next, we're going to burp. And I'm going to spray some Pam, even though I'm not necessarily cooking directly on the grate. It always helps to keep everything healthy in your grill. We're going to put one side like so. And the other opposite. They can overlap a little bit if that helps get the tater tots spread out a little bit more. And now we're going to close the lid. I'm going to let this go for about an hour. Watch, make sure it gets back up to temp. And now we are going to go in and brown some hamburger and Italian sausage and get that going. All right, I got the pan heating up, so I'm going to add the hamburger and the sausage to it. And we're going to do that as neatly as we can without too much splatter. Invariably happens with such an adventure. So now we'll wait for it to heat up even further. All right, as you can see, we're starting to get a little reaction from the meat coming up to temp for browning. So you want to stir it. Truth be told, with all of the liquid I had in there, I probably should have drained it a little bit better before I started this, but hopefully that'll burn into the meat and continue to marinate it. So now, while we are getting to the end of the browning, I'm going to add a little bit of taco seasoning just to get the process started. Not the whole package, just enough to get it in place with the meat while it's really hot. I've drained some of the liquid off already, so that it'll be a little bit less of a soupy mix. Now at this point, if you were prone to using hot sauce, you could use a bit of hot sauce to add in as well. I typically don't, because that can get it a little bit too hot. I'd rather leave that as a side and have them add it as they want to. And I think we're just about there. I'll be back when we mix things together. All right, while we're waiting for the potatoes to finish, we are going to mix together the other ingredients with the meat. And yes, whiskey is good to slow sip. Take your time with it. It helps the cook go that much better. Or, I don't know if it makes it cook any better, but at any rate, what we're going to do now is we're going to mix in. In this particular case, having some juice from this is not terribly bad, because that'll mix in with the potatoes at the bottom once we mix this all together. As long as it's in a soupy mix, which it doesn't appear to be. So now I'm just going to mix these all together. I did add the rest of the seasoning packet to the meat to give it some taco seasoning flavor. And one last thing we're going to do is we're going to add some bacon crumbles. So what we're going to do, again trying to measure, you can't go terribly wrong. I'm doing 3/4 of a cup of bacon crumbles. Now I may add some over the potatoes, and if you notice I have some peppered tomatoes over here that'll go over the potatoes along the base. If you wanted to, you could do along the top as well. I'm choosing not to this time around, just to see how everything turns out. So you got a nice blend of the meat and the vegetables and everything else that a proper hot dish should have. Now, if you're wondering what we're going to do along the top, we are going to use Fiesta nacho cheese soup mixed in with equal portions of salsa con queso. This will be along the top, and I'll add some other cheeses a little bit, not a whole lot. I don't want to get this over cheesy, but it does help with the binding. More to come. Now, keeping the top closed to a very thin gap, as well as the bottom to an equally thin gap, we managed to maintain 250 some degrees, and we have good smoke coming from the smoke box. So now we're going to burp it and look at the potatoes, which should be done. Remember, it's important to burp an acorn just to avoid flare-up. Now, the typical way to tell if I'm done is just kind of the touch test, which these are firm and ready. So what we're going to do is we're going to go over here. We're going to spray our pan real good, and we are going to transfer some potatoes. So now that I'm properly armed with my hot gloves, we're going to take one of these trays and simply just Get them off of there. And do the same with the other. Now at this point is where you find out if you have too many or too few. I don't think we're going to have too few. I think it'll just be just right, as the fairy tale said. And now we're going to go inside and we're going to mix this together and bring it back out. All right, so now what we're going to do, that we're in here, we're going to get some fresh gloves, food safety being paramount. And we are going to begin assembling a hot dish, or casserole as you might be wanting to call it. But first, we're going to take and switch places here with these two, because I want to add along the base some peppered slices of tomato. Now I just do this for a little bit of nuance. You can do more or less depending upon how your family cares for them. Make sure as best you can that the potatoes are laying flat. The next what we're going to do is we are going to add another accent of pepperoni. That was supposed to open, but clearly you gotta be smarter than the pepperoni. So this is just Hormel cut and crisp bold pepperoni. So what we're going to do I notice I changed my gloves a lot because my wife was a food service director for many years and got me in the habit. And you'd be surprised how many people are out cooking in videos or otherwise, and it's nothing wrong with it as long as you keep your hands clean, but gloves just make it easier. So we're going to sprinkle these along the bottom with the tomatoes just to add a little bit of nuance of meat. And yes, we will have a lot of meat already. This just gives us a little bit more surprise at the bottom. So now that once we have that set, we are ready to add some taco cheese to the bottom. Of course, not adding a lot, just enough to perhaps act as a bind on the bottom. As you can see, I didn't add a whole bunch to it. And now we're going to add this in. You don't want to necessarily overflow the pan you're using. In this case, because you can always save this and use it in another hot dish. What we want to do is get this spread out and blend it as good as we can. So now I think we are ready, and I'll save the rest for a dish of some sort. Waste not, want not. Combine it with the rest of the veggies that are left in there. So now we are going to put some topping on. Now with the topping, you want to start by mixing the cheese soup and then you can put in the salsa con queso, or you can just do 2 cans of soup. I'm just kind of eyeballing it here. So you want to stir this really good. You could use a whisk, or it's all going to melt together as we cook it anyway. So then pour it on the top. I think 1 can of soup will do it. Again, we don't want to overflow the pan. And while often it is about the cheese, in this case, we are going to just kind of use a spoon or the spatula, as the case may be, to kind of spread out. I think we might end up using another can of the cheese there. The recipe I was looking at called for 2, and I kind of scoffed a little bit at that. And now I kind of see what they were talking about. So, another can it is. And you can do this for a long time, or you can just leave it, take it as it is, which I think I'm going to do for the moment. So now, because my gloves are all gooey, I'm going to take and only glove up one hand. So what I'm going to do now is add a little bit more pepperoni to the top. Nuance sake. And just to cap off a little bit, we're going to add some light touch Mexican 4 cheese. This is more for nuance than necessity. Because I'm also, just before I put it on, I'm going to dust it with some breadcrumbs. Add a little crust to the top. And I am going to put it back in the smoker. More to come. Given I didn't show you the breadcrumbs, I'm just going to, now that I'm looking at it over the top, I'm going to take breadcrumbs, try to help it just be a little bit of a crust primarily along the edges here. And then once we get to about the hour mark, I'm going to add some French onions on top. Just to make this a virtual cornucopia. Shout out to Cornucopia, Wisconsin, by the way. If you ever get a chance to go down Highway 13 between Superior, Wisconsin and Bayfield, stop and check out the Twin Sisters. So in the park there was my grandfather's fishing boat, and it was my mom and my aunt. So now that we're out here, you can see the thermometer tells me it crept up a little bit, so I closed down the top a little bit more. So it's just a sliver. Same with the bottom. Now we're going to put this in, which will let out a bunch of heat. And you burp it. And we still have smoke coming up from the smoke box, so it's doing its job. So I'm going to set this in the middle, like so. And we're going to let it go for about an hour. And we'll probably check on it in probably about 45 minutes just to see how things are looking. But so far, Old Red is doing her job, and so is the smoke box. So more to come in a little bit. Oh, welcome back. It's been about 45 minutes, and we're going to take a look here. Remembering to burp. And it looks really good, so what I'm going to do is sprinkle a little bit of French onions on top, just to add a little bit of accent. And just to add a little bit of bind to it, little breadcrumbs on top. And then we'll let the heat crank up a little bit. As the wind is picked up, we're going to let this go for about another 15 minutes to maybe half an hour or less, and then we'll bring in the house. So I'm going to sit down here and show you how delicious this is. I think the texture and the flavoring came out really well. Having the tater tots on the bottom really, I think, seemed to give a little nuance to it with the extra amount of meat with the pepperoni, and everything else is very, very delicious. Thank you for joining me for this video today. Again, my website is kiltedswinebbq.com. My shop is shopkiltedswinebbq.com. And if you're interested in my Word Wild West, you can check out sellersjr.com. Please like, share, and subscribe to see more of my videos as they come out, as my smoking experiences with my various smokers continue. I hope you have a great day and a healthy week ahead. Thank you.